question that we get asked quite a lot is, can I leave my timber application untreated? So Kalani is going to cover that one off, and hopefully you'll be able to answer that question once we're done. And then the last one is kind of being able to identify and understand the types of things that you need to consider when choosing a coating for your architectural timber application. Before I begin, just to give you a little bit of background about who we are at Sculptform and why we know what we're talking about. We collaborate extensively with designers and main contractors all over the world to provide what we like to refer to as a highly customizable decorative system for walls, ceilings, and facades. So there's really those high impact areas. And we supply product in both timber and aluminium, but timber is predominantly what we're known for and what we're good at. We've worked with timber for about 15 years. We started our organization in 2005 and did timber Venetian blinds, then moved into decking. And it was about 10 years ago where we moved into kind of the feature wall and ceiling market. We have offices in Melbourne CBD, which is what you see in this slide right now. That's our new office we opened on Queen Street in the CBD. And then our head office is in Bendigo, and that's where our manufacturing plant is. So we're 100% owned and operated. We've also got teams in Sydney and New Zealand, and we've completed projects across the globe and really specialize in working from that early concept stage with architects providing expert advice, especially in relation to timber. And then we follow that all the way through to the builder and installer, bringing that kind of design to life. I'd now like to pass you over to Kalani, who will be discussing why coating timber is important and exploring the different types of coatings available on the market. Thanks, Kalani.
Thanks, Blake, and welcome everyone. I might start today with the most obvious question: why is coating timber so important? So the main reason is protect timber from damage caused by natural elements. So if left uncoated, timber is susceptible to fading, cupping, and the loss of overall dimensional stability. So coatings are designed to slow that process and minimize the damage to timber over time. So it's also to ensure your design intent is met not only the day that the timber is installed, but also 12, 48 months down the track. So the two most prominent problems that cause issues with uncoated timber is water absorption and also UV exposure. So I might start with water absorption. So when timber absorbs too much water, there are two main problems that can arise and dramatically reduce the aesthetic appeal, but also the structural integrity of timber. So firstly, it can create a moist environment that makes the timber more susceptible to fungi and other microorganisms that will cause mold, rot, and decay over time. So what coatings do to prevent this is they effectively seal up the pores and grains, which mold usually becomes trapped in and essentially grows. The second thing that can happen is timber is a hygroscopic compound and it has the tendency to absorb moisture. So problems arise when the timber absorbs too much water or moisture and it's no longer able to balance itself. So when this happens, the timber will start to swell and expand, which causes movement once it's installed. It essentially worsens the wet and dry cycle that timber usually goes through, putting that extra stress on the timber. So next up we have the UV. So UV exposure is responsible for the most damage to timber as it changes and destroys the lignins, which is the compound in timber that hardens and strengthens the cell walls. So without protection, timber will grey off over time due to the drying and bleaching nature of the sun, similar to how your skin would react to a really bad sunburn. When timber is exposed to UV for prolonged periods of time without protection, the drying nature will start to cause splitting, warping, and even cupping over time. So one thing to be super conscious of is that timber won't necessarily grey off consistently, and it's really heavily dependent on the orientation and the exposure levels for the application. So what does coating do to prevent this UV exposure? Well, the colorants contained in the pigmented coatings are responsible for absorbing UV light. So it therefore reduces the stresses that are actually transferred back onto the timber itself. the more colorants contained in a finish, the less UV light that will actually get through to the timber. So we'll jump in now to the types of coating. So timber coatings are generally categorized into four areas, each with its own advantages, disadvantages, color options, and even maintenance requirements. So we have a penetrating oil coating, a surface film coating, a hybrid between the both, so a penetrating oil film hybrid coating, and a water-based coating. So we'll start with a penetrating coating. Some of you may know this as the Q-Tech CD50 in our range. Unlike other coatings, this oil doesn't lay on the surface of the timber and create that thick barrier. What it does is it, when it's applied to the timber, it soaks up and only creates a thin layer on top. So by soaking in the oil, it allows less room for that moisture to absorb into the timber, similar to a wet sponge. So when you've got too much water in there, you can no longer fit anymore. So a penetrating oil is extremely effective at protecting the timber from that moisture, which then creates the movement and rot that I discussed earlier. However, it does break down a lot faster than other coatings, and it actually has to be reapplied quite regularly. When the oil breaks down, it naturally allows the timber to fade off and silver, creating a really natural matte finish. So really great for both internal and external applications. There are options for a penetrating oil to have pigment, and there's quite a lot of different color tones that you can go with. However, something to be wary of is that it actually takes quite some time to dry a pigmented oil, usually around the 2-week mark. So a lot of manufacturers won't actually pre-apply a pigmented oil and instead recommend actually that happening on site. So for some of those larger projects, that's not always a reasonable explanation to have that extra thing happening on site. So something to be wary of. And the ideal uses for a penetrating oil are for all your external applications where you're wanting your design intent to be to silver off, and also it's fine for internal applications, especially in those areas that are susceptible to mold. So we'll now move on to a surface film coating. So this is commonly referred to as a polyurethane coating. The brand we commonly use is Intergrain. The name does kind of give away how this coating works, but generally what happens is it's a film forming finish, and it creates a film on the top of the timber, and it's generally much thicker than what other coatings, the thickness of other coatings, and it does result in a very sheen finish. So this helps to protect the wood from weathering. However, it is only recommended for internal use. So the main reason for this is that the UV will affect the thick coating that's on the outside, and because it does only sit on the surface, the UV will allow that to start chipping and peeling. And so when that happens, the cracks and the peels will expose the unprotected timber, and moisture and sunlight starts to cause advanced deterioration to the timber underneath. It's not all bad though. The surface film finish is really great for internal applications and does come in a large variety of different colors. It's a really great option for applications that need to be easily cleaned and maintained, and it's especially sterile environments such as hospitals and high traffic areas. We'll then move on to our hybrid. So taking the best parts of both the two coatings I've just discussed, this combines the technologies that create that protective layer on the surface of the timber, but it's just less susceptible to peeling. It also penetrates the timber to stop that moisture from seeping in. So designed specifically for external use, the EnviroPro range is our go-to brand. So coatings are available in both clear and pigmented options. However, based on our experience, we recommend using the clear option in only areas that don't actually get that direct UV exposure. So the pigmented options are really great for any external application. So oil film hybrid coatings are highly recommended when you're wanting your design intent to maintain that natural color of the timber, not allowing it to silver off. And it's also got quite a prolonged maintenance period as well. So when the client's not wanting to re-oil the timber every year and kind of extend that out to 2 to 4 years. So lastly, we have the new kid on the block, which is a water-based cream coating. So we've only just adopted the Rubio range ourselves. And so how this works, it's a little bit unique in comparison to other coating options. So it provides a sleek and matte finish through a process called molecular bonding. So it allows allowing the coating to work into the grain of the timber and accentuate that natural grain pattern. So it's our closest coating to having timber uncoated. It's extremely well water repellent, and it stops moisture from absorbing into the timber, causing that stability issue that we discussed earlier. So particularly great for external applications that are exposed to elements. It's also one of the only coatings that we actually recommend a clear coating external that isn't particularly shaded, because it doesn't affect the timber in the way that a surface film does. It doesn't make that peel and crack. It's not actually susceptible to that because of the water-based nature of it. So suitable for both internal and external environments. It's a really great all-round option, and it's actually Blake's favourite as well. So we'll then move on to our comparison table. So I've kind of overloaded you with information on coatings now, but you might be asking, how do you choose which is the best option for your application? It really does come down to design intent. So I'd be asking myself, is my intent for it to silver off over time? Do I want to maintain that natural colour of the timber? How much money do I have to spend? What is the budget? Q-Tech Clear Oil is a really cost-effective option in comparison to the others. That's what you can see there. And then the other big thing is maintenance. So do I want to have to re-oil the timber every year, or is it something that we want to look at every 2 to 4 years? So this brings me to the age-old question, can timber be left uncoated? So essentially, yes. However, there are a lot of considerations that need to be made. This project on the screen is the Maitland Riverlink, and it's a great example of black butt that's been left uncoated. So this was designed by the team at Shirofi, and they worked really closely with McGregor Corksall. The design intent here was to keep the black butt looking as natural as possible. Many coatings can slightly darken the colour of timber, so the design intent was to strip it back to just that raw natural finish. The other thing was that once it fades and loses its colour slightly, they wanted to be able to match that in with the surrounding brick. So let's just run through a couple of things, characteristics that made this application actually work. The first thing to consider is it's an external timber species. So black butt is one of the most durable timbers out there. It's very similar to spotted gum. This application, being a sapphire, isn't exposed to any direct UV light, and there's plenty of airflow behind. So it's avoiding that mold growth that might actually go on in other external applications. And lastly, which something that a lot of people probably wouldn't consider, but it's out of the reach of public. So naturally on our hands, we have a lot of dirt and oil, and that can transfer onto timber, making for uneven colour tones. So the fact that that's raised is really beneficial for the application. So things that need to be considered when actually installing the product, that it's quite unique, but we do recommend that installers wear gloves because of that transfer of oils from the hand. The other thing that really needs to be considered is the storage of the timber. So once it's sent to site, it's recommended that it's not exposed to, like left out in the rain, exposed to the sun, because that will really start to affect the timber before it's even installed. So there's a lot of precautionary things that need to be considered before actually putting the timber up and leaving timber uncoated on an application. I'll pass you back to Blake, who will chat a little bit more about the maintenance requirements of timber and just some of the design options you'll have.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much, Kalani. So that was great. That gives us a little bit of a background about what kind of coatings are available and when to use each of those. Just a reminder to everyone listening in, if you have any questions as we work through it, please raise those in the questions tab, and we'll get to those at the end. I'm going to talk about the maintenance requirements, and then I'm going to touch on some design considerations, and then run through a few project examples before getting to those questions. So when it comes to maintenance, I think now it's really important that we kind of break timber coating applications down into two key separate areas, and that's internal versus external. So internal applications they're perfect for timber. You've got the full suite of coatings available to you. There's kind of no limits in terms of a coating choice, and predominantly, so not probably 99 times out of 100, you'll find that in an internal application, coating maintenance isn't something that you necessarily need to worry about. That's 99 times out of 100. There's probably a 1 in 100 scenario where it is applicable, and I'll probably touch on that really quickly with a project example towards the end. But for the majority of the time, maintenance internally isn't something that you necessarily need to worry about. I guess the only thing that you kind of really need to be mindful of or consider is that some coatings are more suited to certain applications or certain areas. So a really good example of that is a hospital environment. Kalani talked about a surface film coating. So that's something like a polyurethane coating. It creates a surface level on the timber that makes it really easy to clean. And consequently, it's quite well suited for a sterile environment like a hospital. Another really good example is a pool area where anti-mold properties are kind of a necessity for a coating. So you might be like a penetrating oil might be more suited for something like that. But other than that, internal applications, effectively maintenance free, and you have the full suite of coatings available to choose. And that's kind of in comparison to an external application. The word I'd use to describe picking a coating for an external application is cumbersome. And that's the reason I use the word cumbersome, which might have a negative connotation, is that you don't necessarily have all the coatings available to you. And there's a few things that you need to consider, which is UV exposure and then like water absorption as well. And another example of that is again a polyurethane surface film coating. We definitely would not recommend that for an external application, and that's because there's nothing to stop you from installing timber with a polyurethane coating, but over time that UV exposure will cause that coating to crack and peel, and the end result is not going to be what you want to achieve, and the timber is not going to be protected, so we wouldn't recommend it externally. So that takes us to this next educational diagram. And the reason I included this, I think this does a really, really good job of kind of directing where you need to go coating wise, depending on the design intent. So in the last slide, we talked about internal versus external. Internal is effectively maintenance free. So this diagram is now more about how to pick a coating for your external application, and what kind of design direction you need to head down depending on how you answer each of these questions. So the first one is kind of, you've identified that you want to use timber externally, but you would like a low maintenance solution. If low maintenance is the key, and it was kind of the design intent, then we find a really, really popular choice for timber externally is a soffit. And a soffit is it's like a trick in the sense that basically what the soffit does is protects that timber from direct UV exposure and from rain, in essence, so it doesn't go through a wet dry sequence. So that timber almost believes that it's an internal application, and consequently maintenance is kind of null and void or very minimal, and you actually have the full suite of coatings available. And that's in comparison to, so let's say you're designing with timber externally, and you're recognizing that that timber application does need to be exposed or will be exposed to UV. And you've got two choices here. In essence, you can make a decision to allow that timber to kind of naturally silver off, which can be quite beautiful. And if that's the design intent, then you can just apply a clear coating that'll seep in and protect the structure of the timber. And then you can just let it kind of weather off naturally and it'll silver off or gray off over time. Alternatively, if the design intent is to maintain the timbers, the color of the timber from the day of install, then you need to use an external grade coating that has a pigment in it. And then it needs to be maintained regularly. And we'll touch on the maintenance requirements and what that means regularly very shortly. But it definitely, you need to make sure it's a coating, an external grade coating with a pigment, and it's maintained regularly. And then the last one, which we won't talk about too much today, it's not why we're here. The other option is if you wanted to design with timber and you didn't want to worry about maintenance. These days, the wood finish options on aluminium battens are actually fantastic, especially on a large scale design. So we definitely encourage you guys to look into that a little bit more. So the next, probably the biggest challenge that your timber application and coating it's going to face externally is what we call the process of weathering. And this slide does a really, really good example of kind of showcasing what we mean when we talk about it. So on the left-hand side, you've got a snapshot of a project the day that it was installed. And then the right-hand side, that snapshot's actually 5 years after the fact. So it's actually, the coating on this timber's held up really well. It looks like a surface film / penetrating oil hybrid was used, so something like an EnviroPro, and it's held up quite well, but we can start to see the effects of weathering. And weathering is effectively the process of the breakdown of the timber's internal structure. So that's its lignins and its tannins. So lignins serve as the glue that hold the internal timber fibers together, and then the tannins are the chemicals responsible for the color of that timber. So while it's important to protect the timber against the breakdown of lignins to a degree, it's the removal of the tannins that you're going to see first, and they're often the biggest concern when it comes to a timber application and the effects of weathering and design intent. So what does this mean for us as builders or designers when choosing a timber coating? Effectively, we need to make a design choice fairly on in the conceptualization phase and keep that at the forefront. And that's either you decide that you want the timber to kind of maintain its natural color and then use an external grade coating with a pigment, like they've done in this example, or you want the timber to kind of naturally silver off over time, and then the coating choice is vastly different as a result. That brings me to this diagram now, which one of the biggest things we come across is where the design intent is to maintain the timber's natural color in an external application. And that's a tough scenario, because the reality is that the coating that you use in an external scenario, it needs to have a pigment in the coating to kind of repel the UV rays. And that's what you can see. So the diagram on the left is a coating without a pigment, and the UV is coming through and hitting the timber directly, versus on the right-hand side, the coating has a pigment and it kind of reflects the UV. So basically what that means, if we want to protect the timber from the UV, we need to use a coating with a pigment. The challenge is that putting a pigment in a coating is going to change the natural color somewhat. There isn't really, at the moment, a truly clear coating that you can put on timber in an external application that will protect it from UV. So it's definitely something to be wary of. We can apply a coating that'll protect the color from the day that it's installed. But for example, black butt, you might need to use an EnviroPro light oak that has a little bit of a pigment that will change the color slightly, or one of Rubio's ranges. So it's just definitely something to be aware of. We definitely encourage some samples there so you can compare. I now want to talk about silvered off timber. So allowing timber to weather off naturally is really becoming quite popular, and the end result can be quite fantastic, as we can see in this slide just here. And I guess the main advantage to this method is that it drastically reduces the maintenance requirements for that timber application, which these days is often at the forefront of a client's concern when you're discussing or exploring using timber. At this point, maintenance is more focused on preserving the structural integrity, so that's the breakdown of those lignins, rather than maintaining the original color or preserving those tannins. And consequently, it's maintenance requirements are not quite as intense or required quite as regularly. So if the design intent, if this is your design intent, then the best advice we as Sculptform can offer you is that you really need to consider this from the earliest stages of conceptualization. And the timber application really needs to be assessed in kind of a holistic approach, where you're considering the timber elements from all angles of the day. So the intensity of the UV exposure, is that UV exposure consistent across the design? Is there any eaves that are creating shadow, and how does that affect the UV exposure? So for those of you that were with us in our CPD last month, where we discussed designing with timber in an external environment, then we may be covering familiar content. However, it's important to kind of cover it again. It's kind of one of the major design gaps we come across when we work with timber and we're providing our consultative services. It's what we discussed on the last slide, where your design intent is kind of let the timber silver off naturally, but the whole timber application hasn't been considered in a holistic approach. So what we mean by that is this. You can see on this slide just here, this is Dandenong Mental Health, and the front fascia of that building has silvered off quite lovely. It's really consistent, and you compare that to the soffit underneath, which has that really almost that cherry brown kind of color. So that this timber design would have been all the same, the color of that soffit on the day that it was installed, and the fascia has silvered off, and the soffit hasn't been hit by any UV, hasn't got wet, and the color has maintained the same look as kind of day one. Now, fortunately, this has been considered from the earliest stages, and it's actually, the design's broken up quite well. The end result looks fantastic. But I guess you can probably imagine if it was one single timber application with a single plane, and there was an eave that was only on half of it, and then it had shade that was only on half of it for a period of time. And as a result, the UV exposure wasn't consistent across the whole timber plane, then the coloring would be discolored, and the end result wouldn't be quite so clean. So we encourage people designing or builders to kind of consider that from the forefront and design around that. But at the same time, we recognize that you're not always going to be able to design around something like that. You might be in a certain situation where you want to use timber, but you kind of have to put the eave there, or whatever's causing that kind of discoloring or that uneven finish. Fortunately, that's where, so Kalani mentioned we've just teamed up with Rubio. It's basically Rubio have helped us out here. So basically, they have a range of pre-weathered coatings that do a great job of mimicking the effects of the weathering process, and consequently, they can be applied in an application when you're really worried about the discoloring. So what you might do is you put a pre-weathered silver or a pale gray on your, say, black butt application. And what that does is it looks like it's already weathered off. And then kind of as the UV exposure hits certain areas and that timber weathers off and the other stuff is still pristine, it's weathering off, but the color is consistent. The coating already does a great job of kind of mimicking that weathered look. And that's the solution when you can't design around the inconsistent levels of UV exposure. So coating maintenance it's a hot topic, and often one of the first factors raised when discussing a natural timber product with your client. As discussed in an internal scenario, the reality is that timber coating maintenance is effectively non-existent, or 99 times out of 100 is not necessary. And then I guess the same could be said for timber used in an external application where it's protected from direct weather, so a soffit. The main area of concern for timber coating maintenance is external applications where the timber is exposed to direct UV exposure and water absorption and goes through a wet-dry process. I guess what adds a lot of complexity to this scenario is the level and intensity of that exposure is going to play a significant role in determining the maintenance requirements for the project. And as a result, it's really hard for us to kind of sit here and say, well, your timber is going to need to be reapplied on X day every year. So at best, we can provide a rough guide in relation to coating maintenance requirements. So some examples of that are Q-Tech oil is the penetrating oil that Kalani first talked about. This is the coating that's probably going to degrade the quickest externally, and you're likely going to need to reapply every 12 months. In comparison, an EnviroPro Intergrain, so that's that surface film penetrating oil hybrid that combines kind of the best of both, needs to be reapplied every 2 to 4 years. And that's the same with Rubio, so the water-based cream coating. It largely depends on the color when it comes to Rubio. So if you're using a pre-silvered and you're letting it silver off, then the maintenance requirements aren't quite as intensive. But in general, we find every 2 to 4 years. I guess that probably leads us into the next question, where if I'm sitting here saying, well, it's hard for us to determine exactly how often you need to maintain your timber. How do you know when it needs to be, when you need that to reapply that coating? It doesn't sound super scientific, but we call it a water bead test. So the best thing you can do is get like a cup of water or a bucket of water, dip your fingers in the water, get those fingers nice and wet, and then flick the spots of water or the droplets of water across the timber application. And one of two things is going to happen. If it beads up and the water does not absorb then into the timber, then your coating's okay and doesn't need to be reapplied yet. If it does absorb, then it's definitely time to reapply that coating starting to wear off. And what's super important to kind of pick up here and highlight is the earlier that you can catch that the timber coating needs to be reapplied before it's actually started to silver off or before it's cracked or peeled, the better it is for both the timber and then like the labor intensive side of reapplying that coating. Because at that stage, all you really need to do is just come along and reapply the coating, the same coating that you used originally, without having to sand the timber back or strip off the kind of the grade area of the timber. So restoring color is something that comes up quite often. And a great example of this is, if let's say the original design intent was for a silvered off finish with a beautiful kind of natural weathered look. And then after 2 years, the client comes along and says, hey, no, this isn't what I want at all. I prefer the color of the timber the day that was installed. Well, don't fret. We can definitely get it back to its original color. I guess that's one of the beauties of the timber. And I'm gonna steal a line from Shrek here, and that's that timber's like an onion. It has layers. So in essence, you can peel back the weathered finish and kind of start again. So there's a diagram in the top right-hand of this slide that shows kind of the little flaps, and that's like the weathered section of the timber. And we just need to remove those. And then what we're left underneath is kind of like a bareback, beautiful, natural piece of timber that we can then treat however we wish. So to kind of how we go about removing that silver layer depends largely on how long it's been left untreated and how like intense the silvering off is. So for something that's not too bad, you might be able to just get it off with like a high pressure hose. There is Q-Tech and EnviroPro do a range of treatments where you can spray it on. There'll be a chemical reaction, then you get that off with a high pressure hose and you've got that underlayer. And then alternatively, the last thing is or more drastic step is sanding back that silvered off finish. But then you're left with that kind of bareback natural timber application that you can either coat with the coating that you used originally, or you could even, if you wanted a different color or a different finish, you could potentially use a coating with a pigment, and you might go from a light brown to a cherry brown, or however, whatever the design intent is at that time. So it's definitely possible. The next slide, this is where it gets a little bit fun, I guess. So we've now provided quite a lot of context and background about coatings, and when to use them and what to be mindful of when it comes to maintenance. But coatings are great. And why do I say that? Well, the reality is that coatings are effectively an external skin. So they're like a costume that can be used to dress up timber however you wish. A really good example of this is, let's say you really like the lovely, luxurious, dark brown color of walnut timber, and you only have a small application or you have a low budget. And the challenge with walnut is that it's really expensive and it's tough to get a hold of and has a really long lead time. So what do you do in this instance? Well, there's an easy solution. You could use a timber species like an American walnut, which has a similar grain, but then you could use a penetrating oil coating that has a walnut pigment in it. And the end result is effectively a timber product that looks like walnut at a fraction of the cost and a fraction of the lead time. Another great example of how you can use coatings to influence design is to minimize timber variation. So let's say you were looking at utilizing a spotted gum. Spotted gum, it's a lovely timber. It's known for quite a large amount of natural variation in color. It ranges from light brown through definite browns with the occasional red hue. And let's say you're actually picking spotted gum for its fiddleback grain or its interlocking pattern, but you weren't the biggest fan of the natural variation in color. Then again, you can use a coating with a pigment, say a Rubio weathered silver or a dark gray or an olive or even an EnviroPro light oak. And what this would do, once that coating's applied, it would actually balance out or create a much more even palette. So there'll still be some timber variation, but the difference isn't going to be quite as drastic. So that's something to keep in mind. The other thing that is quite common, especially with surface film coatings, so the polyurethane, is that there's quite a large amount of color matching that you can do. Especially in an internal application, we find that there's often a challenge between matching a piece of joinery and the feature timber. And that's where we can color match, and we can do all kinds of things, or we can come up with all kinds of finishes. So that's definitely something to keep in mind. And then finally, there's actually coatings available that can accelerate the silvering off process. So this isn't quite as prevalent now that we have kind of the Rubio pre-silvered or pre-weathered options. But generally, silvering off timber, depending on the application, might take 1 to 2 years on site, and which might be too long. If the design intent is a silvered off finish and you want to achieve it fairly quick, to wait 1 to 2 years doesn't really sit too well. So there are coatings available that you apply it, you install the timber, the sun hits it or the UV hits the timber, there's a chemical reaction with that coating, and it silvers off in 1 to 2 weeks instead of the 1 to 2 years. So there are a few examples of coatings and how it's effectively a costume, and you can dress it up. There's quite a lot we can do with coatings. So if you ever have an application or something that you want to achieve with timber and you're not sure what to do, definitely give us a call. The coatings give us quite a high range of customization and gives everyone as designers quite a lot of freedom. So definitely get in contact with us. Now I want to just work through a couple of project examples. So I mentioned a couple times the internal coating doesn't need maintenance 99 times out of 100, and I think that it's super important now that I address the 1 in 100 times that it does need maintenance. So this is the Novartis Hotel. It's click-on battens with spotted gum, and you can see it's quite a large feature next to some stairs behind glazing. Now, glazing here is kind of the main component that we need to consider. So basically, the glazing does a really good job of kind of dampening or minimizing the effects of the UV exposure that timber is kind of or exposed to. But the reality is that while it minimizes the majority of it, there is some that still seeps through. And let's say it was a clear oil, and clear oil externally is 12 months free application. You definitely wouldn't need to reapply this every 12 months, but at some point it will need some kind of maintenance. So this is kind of that 1 in 100. I think it's super important that we recognize it, and something to just be mindful of. If you are putting timber behind glazing and sun does hit that glazing, there will be some kind of maintenance required at some point. The next one, this is One Melbourne Quarter. So this is designed by Denton Corker Marshall. It's on Collins Street in the Melbourne CBD. Again, spotted gum cladding. The advantage here is that it's an extremely large soffit application, and it's a fantastic example of soffit and how the fact that it's an external environment, but it is protected from, it doesn't get hit by direct sunlight, it doesn't get rained on, so it doesn't go through a wet dry sequence. The reality is that in 10 or 20 years, this timber application is probably the coating's not going to need to be reapplied. It's going to look like the day that it was installed. And then the next one I just wanted to highlight really quickly is Bellevue Hill House. So this is a project again where it's another spotted gum soffit, where maintenance isn't going to be a necessity. But this is just a really, really good example of how you can use timber to kind of transition between two areas. So it carries the same timber plane with the same coating from internal to external. It's very seamless. And I think it really is a large part of the design. But again, effectively maintenance free. So that's it in terms of the content that we wanted to cover today. I'm going to pass over to Kate, who's going to read out any of the questions that have been raised in the questions tab. Again, if anyone has any more, please chuck those in, and then Kate will ask the questions of Kalani and I, and we'll go from there.
Thanks, Blake, and well done. I have to say it's actually been quite enjoyable to be able to sit back and just watch you guys present. I know we've had quite a few questions in the questions tab, so we'll get through them to what we can now. And just a reminder as well, we will send out an email with follow-up answers, so don't feel like we won't get to it. But I might actually start it off with 3 questions for those people that are wanting to get their CPD certificate. So again, they will come out in the email afterwards. And just to recap, so what are the 2 most common types of timber coatings?
Yeah, I might let you fill that one, Kalani.
Yep, so there are 4 in total, so you'll get to choose from the 4 of them. So you have a penetrating oil, a surface film coating, a penetrating oil film hybrid, it always gets me tongue twisted, and a water-based coating.
Thanks, Kalani. And then the second one is, what's the main reason that we actually need to coat timber?
Yeah, well, coating timber is about, in essence, protecting the timber. So water absorption is a huge issue, especially so timber is hygroscopic, which means that it's continually adapting to the moisture of its local environment. So you're protecting against that, and then also for an external application, you're protecting against UV exposure. And you want to protect the kind of the internal stability, so the breakdown of lignins and tannins. So coating is super important. Kalani touched on really quickly about, can you leave it untreated? There are some applications where you can, if that is the design intent that you would like to explore. Definitely, we encourage you to get in contact, and we might run through a few scenarios where that's okay and where it might not be okay. But predominantly, we do recommend that you coat your timber.
And the last one, I think you both actually covered it, but what are the maintenance requirements for timber in internal application?
I might jump in here. So because internal applications aren't exposed to those external elements, it's minimal. So no maintenance internally, unless you are wanting to change the colour or so forth.
Great. And that actually ties really well into the next question, which was, if you're using timber in high traffic areas and you worry about the wear and tear in timber, what more do you need to do, or what recommendations do you have?
I'll leave that one to you, Kalani.
Yeah, sure. So high traffic areas, it depends on whether it's internal or external application. So internally, we definitely recommend a polyurethane coating, purely because it's really easy to clean. And so when there are those scuff marks and things, they're not going to attach to the timber and they're going to come off quite easily. In environments that they are external, highly recommend an option, again, with a coating on it, with a film on it. So either your hybrid option or your water-based coating, so your Rubio.
Thanks. And that actually ties into our next question, which is, I guess, is just elaboration of that. For areas where graffiti is a potential problem, is there a specific solution for that?
Yeah, there definitely is, and it's unfortunate that it's something that we need to consider when designing, but it's the reality of the world we live in. So Dulux do what they call an anti-graffiti coating, and they have a slightly different coating for a timber application. They do it for stone, they do it for aluminium, but basically what it is, so you would still treat your timber in the original coating, let's say a clear oil or a penetrating oil, and it would get delivered to site from the manufacturer with that base level of coating. It would get installed on the wall or on the ceiling or wherever the timber application is, and then the installer would then purchase the anti-graffiti coating from Dulux. They would spray it on the timber application, and what it does is it creates like a thin, what they call an a sacrificial layer. And so if someone unfortunately comes along and graffitis the timber application, then all you need to do is come along with a high pressure hose it down, then reapply the same coating, and that's how you protect against graffiti.
Excellent. Another one that I have, so this is for internal, but one of the trickier ones that I know that we get all the time is how do we treat and protect timber in wet areas, so like pool areas, for example?
Sure. So pool areas can be quite tricky. The main reason they're tricky is not only because of that water absorption and the potential to mold, but also, say, the chemicals or the salt that might be in the water, that can go a long way in actually breaking down coatings over time. So paired with the timber species that you choose to go with, definitely something quite durable. We recommend an oil coating because that has that anti-mold properties. However, a pigmented external grade coating is definitely still an option as well.
I might jump in there as well. So pool environments are a bit of a hot topic at the moment, especially designing with timber in a pool environment. We could almost, we probably will even do a CPD on designing with timber in a wet area. It's there's quite a lot that needs to be considered, especially around not just like coating, obviously, timber species selection, and then even kind of the build up of the structure that carries it, so galvanic corrosion and whatnot. If anyone right now is looking at designing with timber in a wet area, definitely please get in touch with us, as we're learning every day even more and more about that kind of stuff. But it's definitely, as a whole, we could talk for ages about that kind of thing.
Great, thanks, Blake. And going to the other problem we often have with timber, which is Group 1 fire ratings. What do you recommend there?
This is an age-old question as well. For those that aren't aware, timber only satisfies a Group 3 fire rating. So in a lot of circumstances, to satisfy building code, it has to meet a Group 1. So there are actually coatings on the market that you can apply to timber to take it from that Group 3 to Group 1. It's something to be wary of because it can be quite expensive. The other thing is a lot of those coatings as well can create quite a milky finish on top. So it does take away from that natural aesthetic of timber. Definitely still possible. One brand we've used on a couple of projects in the past is Fire Shield. On the other hand, there's definitely the option to use aluminium with a timber look veneer or timber look wrap, because that does satisfy Group 1 without having to do anything to the finish.
Yeah, the Fire Shield's an interesting one. It's a really thick coating, which makes it really difficult to work with. And one of the other challenges is that it takes a few weeks to dry. So what we've often found works better with Fire Shield is if we supply the timber raw to site, and then it gets installed in position, and then the installer goes along and coats it. And that's because the drying off process, it takes so long that often if it gets pre-coated and then you try and transport it, it gets damaged, or if the sun hits it, there's certain things that happen to it as well. Whereas they can install it, make sure it's all okay, and then they can coat it, and then they can just leave it to dry. And we find that often works quite a bit better. But completely right, Kalani, like these days the aluminium with wood finish, it does a really, really good job of mimicking timber. Zero maintenance requirements as well. So we definitely, I definitely encourage people checking out samples, that kind of stuff. It's come a long way in the last few years.
Thanks, Blake. Now, I think this is the project that you were talking about, which is for Novartis Hotel. Would you need a pigmented coating due to some UV coming through the glass?
Yeah, it's a good question. I probably might come back to that one in writing, and just because it's a gray area, because it depends how much of the UVs are kind of being repelled by that glass, and I guess it's largely probably depending on the application. I think you could probably get away with the clear finish, but I think I might want to go away and do a bit of research and then come back in writing on that one. So I'll add that to the follow-up email.
That's a fair point, Blake.
The safe option is always to use a pigment, though. So it's definitely, you can use a clear option, and definitely worth actually assessing the application, like Blake said. But pigment is also a safe option.
Yeah, definitely.
And that ties in, so the question was, why is penetrating oil coating cheaper than all other options? So I guess if you can broadly comment in terms of pricing, what's the difference between the different coatings and why that might be?
Yeah, I'll let you start with this one, Kalani.
Yeah, sure. So for this one, it does come down to actually the labour side of things from our perspective. So for us, we have a moulding line that actually shapes our timber battens and cladding, and the Q-Tech oiler is actually put on the end of that moulding line. So it runs through that as the same time it runs through the rest of the machinery, essentially. For the other three coatings, they, in most situations, require more than one layer of coating and actually have to be applied in our paint shed. So not only is that labour and time, but it's also the additional racking services for those to cure and dry before the additional layers are put onto it as well. So yeah, that's probably best overview.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Kalani. It's like the reality, they do cost, like for us to purchase the coatings, that they do cost slightly different, but that cost is negligible in comparison to like the labor side of things. So like with the penetrating oil, you just attach a machine to the end of the molding line, it goes through that, gets racked out, it can get delivered to site, versus all the other coatings. It's a whole extra step in the production chain. And that's why we do find that often it's a value management or value engineering kind of option that can definitely be explored. The cost saving can be quite substantial, and you can maintain the same design intent in terms of like batten size and spacing. So it's always something that we do recommend exploring.
Thanks, Blake. And so this is not exactly on timber coatings, but it does tie in. And on a personal note, I will mention that I do recall answering very wrong on my initial start at Sculptform, and that relates to pricing of real timber compared to aluminium timber look.
Yeah. So what's the question? Is it like just how do they compare?
How does aluminium timber look compare with price to real timber?
Yeah, good question. And it's really hard to kind of accurately answer it without knowing like a certain situation. So a really good example would be, let's say you have a really chunky piece of timber, like a 32 by 60 black bud, or like a 42 by 42, so a really big thick piece of timber versus something comparable in an aluminium. And then it's largely going to depend on the spacing and whatnot. The sizes aren't identical. The chunkier the piece of the timber, then I would say aluminium with a wood finish is probably the more economical solution, versus some of the smaller pieces of timber versus alu the timber is. So it really depends. I guess the other thing that kind of you need to assess is the lifetime costs, but especially externally versus internally. But like what are the costs of like aluminium wood finish? You set and forget, basically. It's installed, you leave it, off you go. You never have to worry about it. Where timber is a natural product. It's hygroscopic, it's living, it's breathing, it's ever changing. It's going to need some maintenance at some point. So while you might have an initial higher capital outlay with aluminium, over its lifetime, it may be the cheaper option. So it's really project specific there.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, Blake, it does also really depend on timber species as well. So say a spotted gum is our most cost-effective timber species, and then in comparison to an American white oak, which is quite premium, it really depends. The aluminium sometimes sit in the middle price bracket, and yeah, it's just something to consider.
Yeah, it's a fair point. Thanks, Kalani.
There's a lot of factors.
Now we've got time for one more, so this might be the last question. So this is actually about a specific brand, but I think we can elaborate on in terms of changing coatings. So the question was, I've used Lanatec on my spotted gum cladding and decking. Is it possible to apply Rubia over the top of Lanatec coating to achieve the even grain effect? So I was applied 18 months ago, but I think it's a fair point. Can you change between coatings?
Yeah, so I personally haven't worked with Lanatec previously, but my recommendation would always be, if you're looking at changing coatings, then you'd want to remove the existing coating, and then it goes back to my Shrek comment about an onion has layers. and you want to kind of remove that kind of top layer, get back to the bare bone, like the bare back natural raw timber, and then reapply, and then go from there. So the if it's on your decking, there is I don't remember the exact names of it. It's like something like an Intergrain Riviera and a Power Prep or something like that. You can definitely hit me up afterwards for the exact names, but basically it's like a chemical coating that you apply to your deck. There'll be a chemical reaction. It'll lift up the old coating, and then you use, like, I think it's the Power Prep then to kind of clean that all off, and then you've got your bare surface, and then you can go along and apply the Rubio coating, which is water-based and super, super easy to apply.
Excellent. Well, I think we've covered all of the main ones. There's a few that we'll probably cover off in the email, but I'll leave it to you, Blake.
Yeah, cool. Thanks, Kate, and thank you very much, Kalani. And then thank you to everyone who's attended and watched. I hope you found today informative. Definitely, if you've got any more questions, we will definitely get in contact with us, and we will be more than happy to run through that, or any projects or anything you want to talk about. Just to recap, so we will send a follow-up email with the replay that will come immediately once this session ends. For anyone who's here today for the CPD point as well, there'll be a survey. Please fill that survey out, and then we'll get you the certificate for the CPD. But thank you very much for attending. We appreciate that, and hopefully we'll see you all next time.
Thanks, everyone.